The first thing I noticed when I walked through the front door was the smell. Not perfume. Not another man's cologne, nothing that dramatic, nothing that obvious. It was something quieter than that. The house smelled like her in a way it hadn't in years. Lavender and warm cotton and a faint trace of something floral I couldn't immediately name. The kind of scent a woman puts on when she wants to feel beautiful for someone. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my duffel bag still hanging from my shoulder, and I just breathed. 8 months. 8 months in a forward operating base in the eastern desert, sleeping in a cot that gave me a back problem I'll carry for the rest of my life, eating food that tasted like cardboard and chalk, watching men I respected make decisions I couldn't sleep after. 8 months of video calls where the connection cut out at the worst possible moment, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-dash, I love you. 8 months of reading her messages on a 2-hour delay, of holding on to the idea of home like it was a physical object I could squeeze in my fist. And now I was home, and the house smelled like a woman who had somewhere to be. My name is Daniel. I was 34 years old when I came back from that deployment. I'd been in the Army for 11 years, infantry, then logistics officer, then a role I can't be specific about that kept me moving between assignments no one at dinner parties wanted to hear about. I was good at my job. Methodical. Patient. The kind of man who could wait in a foxhole for 6 hours without moving because he understood that timing was everything. I should have applied that same patience to what I found at home. My wife, Claire, was 32. We'd been married for 6 years. We met at a friend's barbecue in Virginia. She was laughing at something someone had said, her head thrown back, and I remember thinking that I'd never heard laughter that unguarded before. She was a graphic designer, freelance, which meant she worked from home and set her own hours. We had a daughter, Mia, who was 5 years old and currently at her grandmother's for the week because Claire had wanted the homecoming to be just us. That should have been the first thing. Instead, I stood in the hallway and breathed in that floral smell and told myself it was nothing. She'd lit a candle. She'd tried a new shampoo. She was excited that I was coming home. I dropped my bag by the stairs. I called her name. She came out of the kitchen in a dress I'd never seen before. Dark green, fitted, the kind of dress you wear to a restaurant, not to greet your husband after 8 months in a war zone. Her hair was done. Her lips were a shade of red she'd stopped wearing years ago because she said it felt like too much effort. She looked, and this is the word that lodged itself somewhere I couldn't reach, nervous. Not nervous the way people are when they've missed someone and the emotion is too big for their body. Nervous the way people are when they've been caught mid-transition, when they've been one thing and are trying to become another thing before you can look too closely. She crossed the room and hugged me, and the hug was real, her arms tight, her face pressed into my neck, a small sound that might have been relief. I held her. I told myself the nervous energy was love. I told myself I was reading too much into a dress and a lipstick color because I'd been in a high-alert environment for 8 months and my threat assessment instincts didn't know how to switch off. You look beautiful, I said. I wanted to make tonight special, she said into my shoulder. Later, when I was unpacking and she was in the kitchen, I noticed the dining table had been set for 2 candles. The good dishes we only used at Christmas. A bottle of wine already opened, already breathing. And on the kitchen counter, half hidden under a takeout menu, a second phone. I didn't say anything about the phone that night. I told myself it was a work phone. She'd started doing more client work, she'd mentioned needing a separate line for business calls. I told myself 100 small rational things while we sat across from each other at that candlelit table and ate the meal she'd ordered from the Italian place 3 streets over, and I drank the wine and listened to her talk about Mia's new teacher and the neighbor's tree that had fallen in the storm last February and the Netflix series she'd been watching that I absolutely had to see. She was good at talking. She'd always been good at talking. One of the things I'd loved most about Claire was that she could carry a conversation anywhere, dinner parties, parking lots, early mornings before either of us had fully surfaced. She had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. That night, she made me feel like a visitor she was being polite to. It was subtle. The way she didn't ask about the deployment beyond the surface questions: was it hard, are you okay, I'm so glad you're home. She'd always been careful about not pushing me on the classified stuff, which I appreciated, but there was a difference between respect and incuriosity. In the past, she'd find the edges of what I could tell her and press gently up against them, hungry for whatever I was allowed to share. That night, she asked 2 questions and moved on before I'd finished answering. I filed it under adjustment period. I'd been gone 8 months. We'd both changed in ways we hadn't mapped yet. The week after I came home had a specific texture I can still feel when I press on it. It felt like walking through a house where every piece of furniture had been moved 2 inches to the left, familiar enough to navigate, wrong enough to keep catching your hip on things. Claire was present but somehow not there. She laughed at the right moments. She cooked my favorite breakfast on the Saturday, eggs with the edges crisped the way I like, strong coffee, the radio on low. She reached for my hand across the table. But there were gaps. Small ones. Pockets of air where her attention went somewhere I couldn't follow. Her phone, both phones, were always face down or in her pocket. On the 3rd day home, I watched her walk to the end of the driveway to take a call. She stood with her back to the house, one hand in her hair. I watched from the upstairs window. The call lasted 4 minutes. When she came back inside, she said it was her mother asking about Mia's pickup schedule. I didn't know yet that I'd started counting things. The number of times she stepped outside to answer calls. The frequency with which she checked the secondary phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The pattern of her waking up before me, earlier than she'd ever naturally risen, the creak of the floorboard outside the bathroom, something I heard with the same precision I'd trained to hear footsteps in compounds overseas. Mia came home on the 5th day. My daughter ran at me from the car door with the kind of full-body commitment that only 5-year-olds are capable of, a shriek that startled the neighbor's dog, her arms wrapping around my legs because she couldn't reach higher. I lifted her and held her and pressed my face into her hair. She smelled like sunscreen and something sweet, a kid's smell, entirely uncomplicated, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 8 months. That evening, Mia sat between us on the couch and told me everything that had happened while I was gone in the way children do, not sequentially, not with any regard for relevance, just an avalanche of moments that mattered to her. Her friend Soph's birthday party. The frog she'd found in the garden. The movie Claire had taken her to see twice because she'd liked it so much. Mommy cried at it, Mia said matter-of-factly. Did she? I looked at Claire over Mia's head. Claire smiled, and the smile was slightly too quick. It was a sad part. What movie? I asked. A beat. Barely a beat, really, the length of a breath. That animated one. You wouldn't know it. I didn't push. But I noticed. 2 nights later, I couldn't sleep. Not unusual, the transition from deployment sleep to civilian sleep always took time, and my nervous system hadn't gotten the message that it was allowed to stand down. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about nothing specific, which was its own kind of specific. Claire's phone lit up on her nightstand. A message notification. The screen glowed for 3 seconds and went dark. She didn't wake up. Or she was very good at appearing not to wake up. I lay there for another hour, and by the time the room grayed with early light, I had quietly decided that I was going to find out what was happening in my own house. There are things you learn in the military about the difference between intelligence and information. Information is just data, raw, uncontextualized, meaningless on its own. Intelligence is what happens when you put information together in the right order, when you trace the pattern beneath the noise. I'd spent years learning how to do that with external threats. Turning those skills inward, on my own home, my own wife, felt like something I needed to wash off afterward. But I couldn't stop. The second phone was a starting point. She kept it in her studio. She'd converted the small back bedroom into a workspace, shelves of design books and Pantone swatches and a second monitor, and I noticed she always took it with her when she left the room. Always. The kind of always that only becomes a pattern when you're already watching for patterns. I didn't go through it. Not yet. The part of me that still wanted to be wrong kept me from crossing that line. Instead, I watched. I noticed that she'd started going to yoga on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, a habit she'd apparently picked up while I was away. She mentioned it casually in the first week, the way you mention something entirely ordinary. The studio was across town. I'd looked it up on a slow afternoon, just to know where she was going, which felt reasonable enough. She left at 8:15 and returned between 10:30 and 11. The yoga class, according to the studio's website, ran from 8:30 to 9:45. The drive was 12 minutes each way. 45 minutes unaccounted for, twice a week. I might have dismissed it as coffee afterward, a slow commute, an errand. But I'd also noticed that she never came back smelling of sweat. Not once. Yoga was the kind of exercise that left a specific physical signature: flushed skin, hair damp at the temples. Claire came back looking composed. Refreshed. The way people look when they've had a shower. Or when they haven't exercised at all. I told myself I could be wrong. I told myself I was pattern matching in a high alert state on civilian data points that didn't warrant a military-grade response. I went for runs in the mornings to burn off the excess vigilance. I called my buddy Marcus. We'd done 2 deployments together. He'd left the army 2 years ago and gone into private security, and we talked for an hour about the readjustment, and he said, "Give it a month, Dan, everything feels wrong for the first month," and I said, "Yeah, you're right," and I believed him while I was saying it. Then my daughter said something that cracked everything slightly open. We were at the kitchen table on a Friday afternoon, Mia coloring in one of her books while I reviewed some paperwork. Claire was in her studio. The house was quiet. "Daddy," Mia said, without looking up from her coloring. "Yeah, Bug? Is Marcus your friend?" I looked up. "Yeah, Marcus is my old army friend." "Why?" "Mommy has a friend too." She selected a new crayon, yellow, then put it back and chose orange. "He came over sometimes. To help with stuff." The sentence dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Yeah." I kept my voice neutral. "What kind of stuff?" "I don't know." She was focused on the coloring. "He fixed the thing under the sink. And once he stayed for dinner, but I was at Grandma's so I didn't see him. Mommy told me after." "What's his friend's name, do you know?" Mia scrunched her face the way she did when she was retrieving something. "Ryan, I think. Or maybe Reese. Something like that." I put my pen down very carefully on the table. "Does Mommy talk about this friend?" Mia shrugged, already losing interest. "Not really. Can we have hot chocolate?" That night, I lay awake and let the name settle. Ryan. Reese. A man who had been in my house, under my sink, at my kitchen table, while I was overseas. A man who Claire had mentioned to my daughter but not to me. Not once in 8 months of video calls, not once in the 2 weeks since I'd come home. A man who apparently didn't exist in the version of our life Claire wanted me to believe in. I got up at 2 in the morning and sat in the dark kitchen and opened my laptop and typed the name of Claire's closest friend, a woman named Joanna who'd been her college roommate, who called every Sunday, who knew everything about Claire that Claire didn't put on display. I stared at Joanna's social media page for 20 minutes, not looking for anything specific. Then I found it. A photo from 3 months ago, a group dinner, 6 people around a restaurant table, Claire in the center, laughing with her head thrown back the same way I'd first fallen in love with. And to her left, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, a man I'd never seen before. The caption tagged everyone at the table, including him. His name was Ryan Holt. Ryan was 36 years old. He ran a small architectural firm with a partner. His social media presence was modest, a professional page, some landscape photography, nothing that gave much away. He was good-looking in an easy, unremarkable way. The kind of face you wouldn't notice at a party but might remember after. He and Claire had 42 mutual friends. I sat with that number. 42 people who knew them both, who had presumably seen them together at the events you accumulate across a social life, who might have watched something develop between them over months while I was on the other side of the world. I almost called Joanna. I held my phone and ran through the conversation in my head and couldn't make it work. Either she knew and would warn Claire, or she didn't know and the call would poison a friendship and potentially make me look paranoid if I was wrong. I put the phone down. Instead, on the following Tuesday morning, when Claire left for her yoga class at 8:15, fresh-faced, her bag light, no visible yoga mat, I got into my car and I followed her. I'm not proud of it. I want to be honest about that. There is a particular kind of shame that comes with tailing your own wife through suburban streets like you're running surveillance on a target, watching her indicator lights in traffic, keeping two cars between us. It felt like a violation of something I'd promised myself about the kind of man I wanted to be. But the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing had already started to erode something inside me in a way I recognized as dangerous. She didn't go to the yoga studio. She drove across town and into a residential neighborhood I didn't know well, a quiet street of newer builds with double garages and neat front gardens, and she parked in front of a house. She sat in the car for 2 minutes, I watched from 50 meters back, engine off, and then she got out and walked to the front door and it opened before she knocked. Ryan stood in the doorway. She went inside. I sat in my car for 40 minutes. I've spent time waiting in much worse circumstances, dust and heat and the particular silence that comes before something happens, but that 40 minutes was its own category of awful. My hands were on the steering wheel and I was looking at the house and my mind was doing something I can only describe as a controlled shutdown. Not panic. Not rage. A cold, steady, terrible clarity. She came out at 10:12. She was pulling her hair back into a tie as she walked to her car, and for a moment I thought she looked different, lighter somehow, the particular looseness of someone who has just been inside something warm. She didn't look around. She just got in her car and drove. I waited until she was gone and then I sat there for another 10 minutes before I started my engine and drove home a different way, a longer route that took me along the river, because I needed the time. She was home when I got back, in her studio, the door open, music playing softly. She didn't ask where I'd been. For 3 days after that I operated in a kind of suspended state that I've since come to understand as a very particular kind of grief, the grief of knowing something you can't unknow, before you've decided what to do about it. I was gentle with Mia. I was polite with Claire. I functioned. I went through the motions of ordinary life with the precision of someone who has learned to compartmentalize in genuinely high-stakes environments, and in some dark way I was grateful for that training because without it I don't know what I would have done. I needed to be certain. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, I didn't, but because I understood that what came next would be irreversible, and I refused to step across that line on circumstantial evidence. On a Thursday evening, while Claire was bathing Mia, I went into her studio. The second phone was in the top drawer of her desk, under a stack of design proofs. I picked it up. It was locked, biometric, fingerprint, and I couldn't access it. But when I held the home button, the preview notifications on the lock screen told me enough. 3 messages from a contact saved simply as R. The previews showed only the first line of each, truncated. Miss you already. Tonight was. Are you sure he doesn't? I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. I left the studio. I went to the living room and sat in the armchair by the window and looked out at the street and the ordinary evening light and thought about the man I'd been 8 months ago, loading into transport with 60 pounds of gear, telling myself that everything I was leaving behind was worth protecting. There was one thing I still didn't understand, and it was the thing that kept snagging me, Joanna. Claire's best friend. The woman who called every Sunday. 2 weeks after I'd come home, Joanna had come for lunch, and the 3 of us had sat in the back garden and it had seemed completely normal. Joanna had hugged me and said how great it was to have me home and asked about Mia's school. Had she known? The whole time. I called her the following morning while Claire was doing school drop-off. I kept it simple. I said I'd found some things that worried me and I needed to understand what had been happening while I was away, and I asked her directly if she knew Ryan. The pause before she answered told me everything. Dan, she said, and her voice had that terrible gentleness of someone preparing to tell you something real. I wanted to tell you. I pushed her to tell you. I want you to know that. I chose a Sunday evening because Mia was at a sleepover, her friend Sof's birthday, the same Sof she'd mentioned on the couch that first week. The timing wasn't calculated cruelty. I needed my daughter out of the house for what I knew was coming, and the universe provided. Claire had made dinner. She did that sometimes, real cooking, from scratch, the kind that suggested she was trying to hold on to something. Roast chicken, the kitchen smelling of herbs and rendered fat. I sat at the kitchen island while she moved around the room, and I watched her with the specific attention of someone who understands they are watching something for the last time, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We ate. We talked about Mia's week, about a project Claire was finishing for a client, about nothing that mattered. The wine was good. The food was good. The evening light came through the back window in that particular autumnal gold that makes everything look like a painting. I let her finish her glass. Then I put my fork down and said, "Tell me about Ryan Holt." The effect was immediate and total. It was like watching a power cut, the light behind her eyes went out and then came back on, different, reconfigured, running on emergency power. Her hand, still holding the stem of her wine glass, went very still. "Where did you?" she started. "It doesn't matter where," I said. My voice was very quiet. I'd thought about this conversation for 10 days and I'd decided that the worst thing I could do was raise my voice, because raised voices create noise, and noise obscures truth, and what I needed was truth. "I need you to tell me." She put the wine glass down. What followed was not a dramatic confession. There was no sobbing breakdown, no falling to her knees, no single moment of operatic revelation. It was worse than that. It was quiet, and specific, and honest in the way that honesty becomes brutal when it's too late. Ryan Holt. She'd known him through a mutual friend, one of the 42, for about 2 years. It had started as friendship. He was going through a divorce. She was dealing with the second deployment. It had become something else around 5 months ago, 4 months before I came home. "How often?" I said. She looked at the table. "Tuesday and Thursday mornings." I nodded slowly. "The yoga class." "I'm sorry, Daniel. Were you in love with him?" A silence that lasted long enough to answer the question. "I don't know," she said. "I think I was, I am, I don't know what I'm saying." She pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I didn't plan it. Was it in this house?" She looked up. "No. Never. I would never," she stopped. "No. I believed that part. I didn't know why it mattered, but it did, slightly." "Mia mentioned him," I said. "She said he fixed something under the sink." Claire's face shifted, pain, specifically the pain of something you thought was contained turning out to have seeped further than you knew. "He came over once when there was a leak. I didn't ask him to come to the house. He offered and I said yes without thinking and I've regretted it. She asked me if you had a friend named Ryan or Reese. I let that land." She was coloring at the kitchen table. She said it so casually, Claire. Like it was completely normal. Something broke on Claire's face then. Not her composure stayed intact, which was almost worse. Something behind her eyes shifted and darkened, and for a moment she looked like a person who had just fully understood the shape of what they'd done. "I know," she said. "Does he know about me?" I asked. "Does he know what I was doing for 8 months?" "Yes." "And?" She was quiet for a long moment. "He said it made it complicated." I almost laughed. "Complicated?" I had been in places where complicated was a word that preceded evacuation protocols, and the man my wife was sleeping with had found my existence complicated. Did Joanna try to stop you? I asked. She looked up sharply. I called her, I said. She told me she'd pushed you to end it. Or to tell me. Claire closed her eyes. She did. Multiple times. But you didn't. No. There was a very long silence. Outside, somewhere on the street, a car door closed. A dog barked twice and went quiet. Were you going to tell me? I asked. At any point. If I hadn't found out. Were you going to sit across from me at this table and tell me? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was very small. I told myself I would end it before you came home. I told myself it would just stop, and I'd never have to tell you, and it would be like it never happened. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you were waiting for me to be a problem you didn't have to solve, I said. She flinched. That's not, she stopped. Maybe. I don't know. I was scared. Of what? Of losing you. Of you leaving. Of what it would do to Mia. Her voice broke slightly on our daughter's name. I'm not trying to make excuses. I know there are none. What did you want? I asked. In an ideal world, what were you hoping for? She looked at me for a long time. And in her eyes I could see it clearly, she hadn't known what she wanted. She'd wanted both things, the way people do when they're not being honest with themselves, and she'd chosen the path of least immediate resistance, which was secrecy, and she'd followed that path until it ended here, at this table, in this beautiful terrible ordinary light. I don't know, she said. That's the most honest thing you've said all evening, I said. I got up from the table. I put my plate in the sink. I stood at the window for a moment and looked at the back garden, where Mia's bicycle was leaning against the fence, where the shed door I'd never gotten around to fixing was still hanging at a slight angle. I'm going to stay at Marcus's, I said. While we figure out what happens next. Daniel. Not tonight, I said. I can't talk more tonight. I packed a bag with the methodical precision of someone who has packed under far worse circumstances, and I drove to Marcus's apartment, and I sat in his spare room in the dark for a long time before I could sleep. The weeks that followed had a texture I've struggled to describe to anyone who asks. It wasn't devastation in the cinematic sense, not collapsed on the floor, unable to function. It was more like operating on a reduced frequency. Like someone had turned the world down slightly and I was doing everything at the right volume anyway, out of habit and necessity, because my daughter needed me to. Mia was the lodestone. When everything else had become uncertain and strange, she remained completely herself, 5 years old, fully committed to the texture of the world at 5, her grief at Daddy not living at home a real and present thing that she expressed with a directness that adults spend years trying to recover. She cried when I dropped her off. She called me to tell me about things she'd seen, a bird on the school fence, a drawing she'd done, a joke she'd heard that didn't quite work but that she delivered with complete conviction. I told her I loved her every time, and I meant it more than any military oath I'd ever taken. Claire and I began the process that people call working things out, and that looks, from the inside, like a series of carefully moderated conversations in which two people try to speak honestly to each other after trust has been removed from the equation. We saw a counselor, a woman named Patricia who had an office with too many plants and a way of asking questions that left nowhere to hide. I went because I'd made promises and because I believed in honoring commitments even when the cost was high. I went because I needed to understand what had happened in this marriage while I was away, and whether any of it was recoverable. What I learned in those sessions was not what I expected. I learned that Claire had been lonely in a way she'd never fully articulated. Not the loneliness of missing someone you love, she'd had that too, but a deeper structural loneliness, the loneliness of being the person who manages everything alone for months at a time, who makes every decision, who holds everything together and then has to dismantle the self-sufficiency when the person returns, has to rebuild a joint life with someone who is readjusting from experiences they can only partially share. She'd done it twice. She'd done it without complaint, without adequate acknowledgement, without the support structures that might have made it survivable. That wasn't an excuse. I want to be clear about that, and I was clear about it in the counselor's room with both of them listening. There is no version of what Claire did that becomes acceptable because the circumstances were hard. But I was able to hold both things at once, the wrongness of her choice, and the reality of what had created the conditions for it, in a way that I think only became possible because I'd been genuinely afraid of oversimplifying. What I also learned, and this is the thing I've sat with longest, is that I had been disappearing from this marriage for years before the deployment. Not intentionally. Not carelessly. But the accumulation of absence, of priority, of the way a military career asks everything of you and the people attached to you, had built a distance between Claire and me that neither of us had fully named. She'd filled that distance with Ryan Holt. I'd filled mine with mission. Neither of us had been paying attention. Ryan Holt, for his part, ended things with Claire after the confrontation. Or she ended them, the details were hers, and she kept them. I didn't ask, because by that point I understood that there were parts of this that I didn't need to own. He became simply a name, a shape in the story, a man who had moved through my life without my knowledge and was now on the other side of whatever wall had been built. By December, Claire and I had made a decision. It wasn't the decision that people hope for when they tell you that couples work through these things. It wasn't reconciliation, though we'd considered it honestly, spent weeks in that room with Patricia examining it from every angle, trying to find the version of the future where we rebuilt what had been broken. It wasn't dismissal either, the clean angry cut that people sometimes need. It was something harder and more specific, the decision to end the marriage with as much integrity as we could bring to it. To do it slowly, carefully, with our daughter's life at the center. To remain, in some form, a family to Mia even as we ceased to be one to each other. I moved into an apartment 20 minutes from the house. Close enough to do school drop-offs on alternate weeks, to be there for Saturday mornings with cartoons and cereal, to be a present father in the way that mattered. The apartment was small and slightly sparse, and on evenings when Mia wasn't there it had a silence I was learning to be inside without fighting. There are things I've been asked, by Marcus, by my sister, by the counselor in our last session, about forgiveness. Whether I've forgiven Claire. Whether I've forgiven myself for the ways I wasn't present even when I was home. I don't have a clean answer. What I have is something more honest than forgiveness, which is understanding. I understand how it happened. I understand the sequence of conditions and choices and human failures that produced this outcome. Understanding is not the same as peace, but it's a start. I think about the man who came home to that house 8 months ago, who stood in the hallway and breathed in the smell of something wrong and told himself it was nothing. That man wanted so badly not to know. He protected himself with rationalization and deployment-trained patience and love that was real and insufficient in equal measure. He'd come home from a place where the danger was visible and walked into a danger he didn't have the tools for. The house is still there. Claire is still there, working, raising our daughter, building a version of her life I'm not part of. The bicycle is still leaning against the back fence. I drive past sometimes on my way to pick up Mia, and I feel something I can't entirely name, not grief exactly, not anger, something more like the specific ache of a life that was real and is now past. Mia asked me last week if I was sad. I thought about it for a moment, really thought, the way she deserved. Sometimes, I said. But not always. And it's getting better. She considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old processing something beyond her years. Good, she said. And went back to her drawing. I sat across from her at my kitchen table in my small apartment and watched her color and thought about all the ways a life can break and partially reassemble and continue. About the things we survive that we didn't think we would. About the things we carry forward. Outside, the autumn light was doing that gold thing again, the same quality of light as the night I'd confronted Claire, and the evening I'd come home, and 1,000 evenings before that when everything had seemed possible. I didn't know what came next. I still don't. But I was here. I was present. I was paying attention. Maybe that was the place to start. The story of Daniel and Claire is not simply a story about infidelity. It is a story about what happens to two people when they stop speaking honestly to each other, and how silence, compounded over years, eventually fills itself with something destructive. The first thing worth examining is Daniel's posture upon returning home. He is a man trained to read environments, to notice anomalies, to assess threat, and within the first hour, he notices several. The smell of the house. Claire's dress. Her nervous energy. The second phone. And yet he rationalizes every single one. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a profoundly human act of self-protection. Would you have noticed the same things, and pushed them away for the same reasons? We want the world we love to be intact. We invest enormous psychological energy in keeping our understanding of reality coherent, and when the evidence challenges that understanding, denial is often the first and most natural response. What makes Daniel's denial particularly poignant is that it comes wrapped in professional training. He is a man who has spent his career trusting his instincts, and here he is, deliberately overriding them. That tension is psychologically real, the part of him that knows, and the part that refuses to know, running simultaneously. The most devastating detail in the story is not the affair itself. It is Mia's mention of Ryan at the kitchen table. Innocently, casually, the way children expose what adults conceal, she hands her father the thread he needs to unravel everything. Children occupy a different moral space. They haven't yet learned that some truths are socially inconvenient. Mia's remark shifts the story from suspicion to confirmation in a sentence and a half, and it does so without malice or drama. That is exactly the kind of detail that hits hardest. Claire's character is worth examining beyond simple condemnation. The story is careful, perhaps deliberately so, to resist making her a villain. Her loneliness was real. Her failure to articulate it was also real. 2 deployments, complete household management, the constant emotional reconfiguration of a partner who exists and then doesn't exist and then exists again in a changed form, these are genuine pressures that military spouses carry. Does that understanding change how you see her choice? It shouldn't excuse it. But it should complicate our judgment, because the most honest thing the story does is show that betrayal rarely emerges from nowhere. It emerges from an accumulation of distance that neither party named until it was too late. The investigation sequence, particularly Daniel following Claire to Ryan's house, is the moral center of the story's 4th act. He is doing something he finds shameful, that he explicitly marks as a violation of the kind of man he wants to be, and he does it anyway because the alternative is a lie he can't sustain. This is the nature of discovery, it requires transgressing your own ideals to access truth. And the 40 minutes he sits outside that house are the story's most quietly devastating passage, not for what is explicit, but for what is happening to his sense of reality in that silence. Joanna's role adds important moral texture. She knew. She pushed for honesty. She failed to act beyond encouragement. She is neither villain nor hero, she is what most of us would be, uncomfortable with someone else's secret, unwilling to take the consequence-bearing step of telling the deceived party directly. When Daniel calls her, her pause before answering is a confession of its own. The confrontation scene is structurally restrained, and that restraint is the right choice. Quiet confrontations, paradoxically, are often more devastating than explosive ones because they leave no noise to hide behind. Daniel asks precise questions. Claire answers them with increasing honesty. At what point in that conversation do you think she fully understood what she had actually done? The answer seems to be the moment he mentions Mia, the moment she realizes that her secret had already touched her daughter without her knowledge or consent. That is where her composure finally shifts. The resolution is the story's most psychologically sophisticated section. Daniel does not choose dramatic exit or desperate reconciliation. He chooses a third thing, honest ending, managed carefully, with their daughter at the center. This is genuinely difficult, and it resists the easy satisfaction of either narrative closure. He also acknowledges his own contribution, the years of structural absence, the way military service and marital presence are often incompatible, without using it as mitigation. That self-awareness, arrived at through counseling and hard reflection, is the story's core act of growth. Step back from the specifics of this story, the deployment, the affair, the confrontation, and what you find underneath is something far more universal. This is a story about the gap between the life we are living and the life we believe we are living. Both Daniel and Claire were, for years, participants in a shared reality that had quietly diverged from what they each imagined it to be. He believed the marriage was a stable anchor. She had already started to drift from it. Neither of them said anything. That silence is where the real betrayal lies, not just the one Claire committed, but the broader failure both of them participated in, the failure to speak the true thing before it became too late to speak it safely. What is remarkable about Daniel's trajectory is not that he survived the betrayal. It is that he arrived, eventually, at a place where he could hold his own complicity without using it to absolve Claire and without using Claire's guilt to avoid examining himself. That capacity, to carry more than one truth at once, to refuse the simplicity of being only a victim or only a wronged party, is genuinely rare, and it is the thing that makes the ending feel earned rather than neat. The story asks, implicitly, a question about what we actually protect when we go to great lengths to protect something. Daniel protected a country, a mission, an abstract idea of home. What he didn't protect, because he didn't realize it needed protection, was the daily, unglamorous work of staying present inside his own marriage. We are all, in our own ways, returning from deployments we chose over something closer. The question the story leaves behind is not whether Claire was wrong, she was, but whether you would have noticed the distance before it filled with someone else's presence. And if you had noticed, whether you would have done anything about it. That is not a comfortable question. It isn't meant to be.